fiscal differences unresolved. President Trump holding an Oval Office meeting to push toward a last-minute breakthrough. Ben, what are the stakes and what is next?
Yeah, as you mentioned, this Oval Office meeting is what we're waiting for. It was scheduled to start at 3 p.m., but it's been delayed at the White House. President Trump is currently in the middle of a press conference with the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. But when they eventually get together, this is Trump and the top 4 congressional leaders, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. This is what all eyes are watching, and the expectations at the moment are pretty low as to sort of how these two sides, who continually are just talking past each other, can come to a deal. A range of issues kind of are still outstanding. One I wrote about today was about rescissions. This is Washington speak for the president's ability to essentially unilaterally cancel spending. The Democrat case there is basically, why would we negotiate with you if you're just going to cancel whatever we agreed to down the road? So there's a lot of distrust on both sides, and both sides have shown little to no evidence of any kind of blinking at the moment. Healthcare is another major flashpoint we saw today. That was a kind of off-ramp that was seen as possibly a way to avert this, but Democrats appear to be batting it down. One thing I'll be watching, especially in this meeting this afternoon, is basically whether or not we see it. The expectation going in has been that this is going to be a political theater moment, kind of a time for all sides to yell at each other in front of the cameras. As for the moment, this could change any minute, is that cameras aren't going to be allowed in so that the two sides may actually have some level of negotiations. We'll see if there's any progress that they can make behind closed doors, but again, that could change any minute, and reporters could be allowed in. One headline that just crossed a minute before I came on that I think is kind of emblematic of how little expectation there is for any sort of grand bargain here. Axios just crossed a headline that Chuck Schumer is floating a plan that would avert a shutdown, but for only 7 days. So you would kind of delay things for just 7 days to kind of keep this fight going a little bit into October, but very, very few expectations that we're not going to be talking about this all fall.
All right, Ben, Jared, thank you guys.
Sure thing.
A government shutdown is looming once again. President Trump is meeting with top congressional leaders today as current federal funding is set to expire tomorrow. The bill on the table now would only fund the government through mid-November, and it must pass before October 1st to avoid a shutdown. Joining me now on this is Shai Akabis, Bipartisan Policy Center Director of Economic Policy. Shai, it's good to see you. So here we are again with this situation. I guess one of the advantages of having gone through this before is we sort of know what to expect in terms of the economic impact. You know, we can kind of game it out depending on how long it lasts. So what do we know? What do we need to watch as this unfolds?
Yeah, so some parts of our country are known for producing cars or soybeans. In Washington, we're known for producing 11th hour budget drama, and we're here again. As you said, we've seen this play out before, and we know generally what the consequences look like as the government shuts down. It's inefficient, it's costly, it's inconvenient for many businesses and consumers across the country. You know, this is going to be the 29th out of the last 29 years that Congress has failed to get its budget done on time. If nothing else, this demonstrates that the budget process is fundamentally broken. We've known about both the deadline to fund our government, October 1st, the start of the fiscal year, and the expiration of these enhanced healthcare tax credits, the ACA credits, for a long, long time. And Congress has not acted yet. And now here we are again with less than 48 hours left and going into the brink of a government shutdown.
So what's the potential economic cost here as we, if indeed this does happen?
So it's hard to know exactly because part of it will depend on exactly what the plans look like for shutting down the government. Those are called contingency plans that each agency is supposed to put out well in advance of the shutdown so that both the employees who work at those agencies and everybody else in the economy who works with them knows what that will look like. This time around, they've actually been very delayed in putting out those plans. So some of them have been trickling out over the weekend, this morning, and we have yet to digest exactly what that looks like. But roughly, what we've seen in the past is that short government shutdowns are just inefficient, don't have a large effect on the economy. When it drags on, like the one in 2018 and 2019 did, that one lasted 34 days, then it can really start to materially have an economic impact. That one was estimated to have cost at least $3 billion to our national GDP. That's not overwhelming. It's not going to by itself throw us into a recession, but it is costly. It is something that we really need to try to avoid. And unfortunately, it's a pattern that we've gotten ourselves into.
Shai, what do you make of the administration's threat that maybe some of these furloughs would become permanent? Would that, on the one hand, have a positive effect on spending? How do you think about that?
There's lots of ways that we can go about improving the federal budget, the fiscal status of the federal budget. Shutting down the government is not one of them. It never results in budget savings. The only way to produce budget savings is for Congress to enact those savings and the president to execute them. And what we get with the government shutdown is actually the opposite. We are paying government employees not to work because the government sends, in the past, roughly 40% of its employees home. They get furloughed, and they are ultimately back paid, but not doing the work of the federal government of the American people while the government shutdown is going. So it's not an effective way to cut costs. There is lots of waste and inefficiency in the federal government, and we should be looking on a bipartisan basis to cut that down. But doing so on the brink of a shutdown or during a shutdown is not the ideal way to go about that in a manner that's going to produce the intended results.
Well, but Shai, I mean, this time they're saying they're not just going to furlough some of these folks. They're going to say, don't come back, right? I mean, so how seriously do they take that threat, and then what effect does that have?
Yeah, so the fact of the matter is we've already seen significant changes to the federal workforce over the last 9 months or so. We've had about 300,000 federal employees that as of the end of this fiscal year will no longer be with the federal government relative to before. And so sure, it's possible that the executive branch, as they've indicated, may try to take additional action and lay off additional employees during a shutdown. That would not be the practice in the past, and I think it's questionable whether that is legal. I'm not a lawyer, so we'll not weigh in on that. But if that happens, yes, it could further hamper government operations depending on how those cuts are made, and obviously it will affect the employees that are impacted. But more broadly, I think we need to be considering the impacts that will happen across the United States. Most federal employees do not work in Washington. Most of them are in communities across the country, and both them, the contractors that work with them, and then the communities, the businesses that rely on those employees. So if you have a small business in a federal office building or right next to a federal office building, if none of those employees are coming in, then the business isn't making any money. State and local governments, a lot of them rely on the federal government for the services that they provide. And if there's an extended shutdown, then they have difficulty providing those services. So there's lots of effects that trickle out throughout the economy. And the quicker that the two parties can come together and reach a deal, the better it will be for everyone.
You started off by saying this is the 29th of 29 years that we have gone through this, Shai. How do we keep this from happening?
Yeah. So we find ourselves here because both of our political differences and the sort of broken down functioning of our ability to govern and budget, and also the fact that we have an enormous federal debt burden, which has sort of paralyzed our ability to deal with it. We don't have a functioning process where we address revenues, address spending in a coherent manner in bipartisan negotiations. And so what tends to happen is the only moment for a pressure point is something like a government shutdown or a debt limit potential default. That's extremely risky, extremely inefficient, and we need to find a better way. If we don't resolve our political differences, no process by itself is going to force the two parties to work together. So ultimately, we need both of them to be working in the interest of the American people, come to the table and find agreement that can both keep the government open and address other important priorities like healthcare costs.
Shai, thanks so much. Appreciate your perspective.
Thanks for having me.
When clients ask you, Kim, your latest government shutdown odds, what are they, Kim? Walk us through it.
Well, Josh, I was at 60% up until last Wednesday that there would be no shutdown. And then with developments of the president canceling a meeting with Democrats and interviews that the House Democratic leader Jeffries gave on Thursday night, I reversed. I went to 60% chance of a shutdown, and I stipulated to our clients that we'd watch Sunday. Developments on Sunday usually give you some sense of these short schedules. Well, the president accepting the meeting, neither side is going into that meeting to convince the other. And with Democrats increasingly understanding that their top issue, which is health care, is hard for them to execute for their constituents in a shutdown, led us back to 60% today that there will be no shutdown. I've watched these things since the bad ones back in the 80s. 3 days out, if you're really headed for a shutdown, you don't have many meetings. And you certainly have many more members on each side pounding their chest, trying to explain why shutdown is the only way to do business. You haven't heard that from either side this time. So for a lot of reasons, I think odds are low and going lower of a shutdown.
Let me ask you, Kim, if there was a shutdown, I'm just curious, who do you think the American public would blame for that?
That's one of my main reasons why I doubt either side is going to force this. No one wins these. History shows of the 5 longest, 2 of them happened in the 70s. They were caught up in Watergate. Those shutdowns helped Democrats in the midterms of 78. The longest one on record was in the the beginning of 19. There's no evidence that did President Trump any favors in 2020 or his party. And in between, the fiscal 2014 shutdown that was at the end of 13 obviously stung the perceived instigator, then Senator Cruz, who hasn't returned to the shutdown scene in the decade plus since. No one wins these things. Eventually, the American population blames Washington for dysfunction almost equitably. I think it's really hard for a unitary government that has had a really strong role the last 8 months in the economy and in geopolitics, pretty much achieving everything it has set out to do in the campaign, to make a case that Democrats are to be blamed for government dysfunction. On the other side, Democrats want to highlight what they perceive as bad healthcare policy from Republicans. It's hard to do that if you're in a shutdown, because then the shutdown becomes the top line message and story 2 and 3. It's much easier to do if you are fighting on the floor of the Senate and in committees, highlighting what you think are the shortcomings of previous healthcare policies and ones coming up, including the Affordable Care Act tax benefit that expires at the end of the year.
So we're placing our bets here, Kim, whether a shutdown occurs. I'm going to watch this meeting very carefully. I know an important question investors have, Kim, is if there was a shutdown, hypothetically, and you try to play this out, game this out, how long you think such a shutdown could last? How do you try to advise and guide clients about that answer?
You know, Josh, it's a good point this week in particular. We have Yom Kippur this week. And so if a shutdown begins at midnight October 1, it will be very near impossible for Washington to cut it off sooner than 5, 6, or 7 days. Very near impossible. The risk both sides run once you get into these things, and I think the 2013 episode was probably the most salient. Once you get into these things, it's very difficult to put the path back to peace together. Partisans on your side think they're winning. They want to see more pain on the other side. People on the other side, in this case, the opposition, want to believe that they are highlighting the just cause. And in the meantime, after a week, you start to see payments slowing. You start to see constituents concerned about benefits and their payment on time. Dysfunction starts to creep into the government, whether you believe this is the most dysfunctional government you can remember in time or not, or if you think it's the best and most effective. At some point, beginning week 2, you begin to feel constituents ire because government is not working, and they really don't know why. There's not a defining issue here between Republicans and Democrats that would force them to close the government, as opposed to do what democracy was built to do, debate and act.
I'm curious, Kim, what did you make, finally, of the Trump administration's threat there to potentially use a government shutdown to permanently dismiss federal employees?
My first reaction is they're doing that now. They've been doing that for 7 months. And the Supreme Court has just recently given them reason to believe they have unfettered ability to do this. I'm not sure that a shutdown is an incremental improvement in their toolbox. It does, however, that shutdown would point out that those layoffs and shuttering of agencies, or parts of them anyway, will take people back to the February-March period when Elon Musk was using his effort within government to reduce payrolls. Politically, that did not play well for Republicans on Capitol Hill, and it was part of the pushback that came with the March-April trade announcement that caused the White House to back down on April 9. There was just too much going on, most of it being negatively received across the political spectrum.
Kim, always great to see you. Thank you, sir.
Be well, Josh.
Key economic reports could vanish if a government shutdown happens, taking with them critical signals for the Fed. John Hilsenrath joins us to explain how missing jobs, inflation, and spending data could blink policymakers and what that means for markets and monetary policy. John, great to see you. So, all right, we're on government shutdown watch, John.
Yeah,
we're
seems
waiting.
like we get one of these every
We sure
few
do.
years.
It sure does. But let's say it happens, all right? Everyone's placing their bets. If we saw that happen, that could mean, John, potentially what for the pace and publication of that all-important government data, the jobs data, the inflation data? What does it mean?
Well, it's the jobs data that really matters in this particular case, and also the next round of inflation data, because from the Federal Reserve's perspective, they meet again in late October. They only get one more batch of data before they have to make a decision about whether to cut interest rates again, right? So if we don't get the October jobs report, or if we don't get the October inflation report, they're flying blind going into the next meeting. It makes it a little bit harder to make a call that's already a little bit of a close call to begin with. Now, these shutdowns, they tend to wash out. They tend to be non-events for the economy and for the markets, but there's a little bit more at stake this time. And it's also, frankly, kind of hard to see what the incentives are for either side to compromise with each other on this one.
Could private sector data, John, fill in some of that gap or no?
No.
It couldn't.
No, I mean, we have ADP data, for instance, on the employment on the jobs front, but it's very often far away from where the BLS, a deeper, richer study tends to go. So, from the Fed's perspective, though, it's not necessarily going to take private sector ADP data to heart, but it's going to look at how the markets respond to a shutdown and how they're positioned going into the next meeting when they decide what they want to do.
So if you have the shutdown and, okay, now we have some interruption to the data, what does the Fed do in that situation, John, with the next meeting on deck?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's a tough call for them to make with only 1 month of data before the next chance they get to look at. I mean, I think they take a lot of cues, not necessarily from private data like ADP, but from the markets. How are the bond markets behaving? What are the futures markets pricing in? What are forward markets pricing in for a move? The low risk thing to do would just be to stay on hold until you get to see more data. But if the markets right now are priced 90% for a rate cut in October, and if the Fed doesn't deliver something the market is expecting because it's flying blind, it could cause some turbulence.
Is John Hilsenrath at 90%?
No.
No, how come?
No, because if you listen to Fed speakers this week, the last few days, and if you listen to what Jay Powell was trying to say at the last Fed meeting, they want to have a little bit of wiggle room. There's still an inflation problem. It hasn't gone away. We had a couple of Fed speakers today, Beth Hammack, Alberto Musalem. They're still talking about, inflation is a percentage point above the Fed's 2% target. There's some aversion to going too far on this. Now, there's the Trump appointee, Stephen Miran, who's making an argument the Fed should do a succession of half-point rate cuts. He doesn't have the rest of the FOMC on board with him on that.
I saw an FT poll. I'm going to ask John about this. I got to get the Hilsenrath response. Did you see this one? They polled academic economists, all right? Overwhelmingly, they want Waller to succeed Jay Powell. That's what they want, John, 82%. But few think, according to this poll, he's going to get the job. Hassett, they say, Kevin Hassett is seen as the man most likely to head the Fed. What is your take on that poll?
It's funny you should ask that question because I do a survey myself with Duke University.
Did it dovetail with this?
In some ways, and it actually adds to it. I survey former Fed officials, former governors, former regional bank presidents, former senior economists there, ask them the same question. In fact, I think maybe the FT came after me. Asked them the same question. Unanimously, they say Chris Waller, and they also express some skepticism because they think he would be most independent. Not a single person voted for Kevin Hassett in my survey of former Fed officials. Yeah. So, and I think it's important for this reason. I think if Waller were to end up getting the job, you see economists saying this, you see former Fed officials. I think that's the guy that the markets would feel comfortable with. So to the extent There's some concern about Fed independence, the Fed's determination to get inflation back to. I think the market would feel comfortable with Waller. If Hassett gets the job, he's going to have to do a little work to build his own credibility, not only inside the institution, but with the marketplace.
John, great to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much.